Thank you. Well, thank you, Alfred. I want to extend special thanks to Alfred for inviting me, to Michael Kemper also for taking care of various things, and all of you for coming. The first thing I have to say is that it really is, well, humbling, but it begins to get a bit ridiculous. I look at this audience and I see many established senior scholars from whom I have learned so much over the years. And then I also see various younger generations, several younger generations from whom I know, I hope if I live long enough, I will learn even more, because things are really getting underway in this field well beyond what they were when I first started. So the idea that I can tell you something that you don't already know is rather foolish for me to even be up here. But I'm here, I have a job to do, so I'll get with it. Well, there are many who are here who should be in my place, but let's pretend that I'm the one to do this. If the task of the keynoter is to put you to sleep, then I'm probably the man for it. And if it's to tell you things you already know, then I can do that, okay? The study of Islam or of Muslim religious life in the Soviet Union was a politically charged scholarly enterprise, as conducted both in the USSR itself and in what we then called the West. Sometimes we still do. The political climate that both fostered and shaped scholarly efforts to understand and assess the status of Muslim religious life and the political, economic, social, military, and demographic implications of the Muslim presence in the Soviet Union changed in many respects, if not in all, with the breakup of the Soviet state. But with a few exceptions, the approaches and the questions asked and the broad outlines of the standard assessments with regard to Muslim Eurasia retain the imprint, at least, of the politically shaped scholarship of the Cold War era. This is true, arguably, with regard to studies ostensibly focused on Islam in Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia at present, but it is also true with regard to discussions of the most recent era that has now been relegated to the sphere of historical background, namely the Soviet period. We are, to be sure, gradually learning the extent of what we did not know that we did not know about Islam in the Soviet Union through increased access to archival material, to private collections of manuscripts, papers, and memorabilia, and here and there to the living memories of Muslims and others who lived through substantial portions of the Soviet era. Though in the latter case, it has to be acknowledged how late to the game Western ethnographers and sociologists were when it came to gathering insights into Soviet-era religious life, a sphere that expectations framed in the Soviet era and by Western Sovietological scholarship relegated to secondary or tertiary importance behind the hot topics of civil society, institutional developments, and economic reform, which drew extensive study but never happened, thus leaving one or more likely two generations of Soviet Muslims with memories reaching deep into the Soviet era, largely unasked for their recollections. But by and large, the study of Muslim religious life in the post-Soviet era has not advanced significantly beyond the Cold War era scholarship on Islam in the Soviet Union, at least in terms of analytical stances and the basic framing of the issues. Some new data is being employed, but much the same questions are being asked of it, and the same often cliched understandings of Islam and of religiosity continue to shape the literature. Indeed, whenever I begin to think that things are improving in the scholarly study of Islam in the former Soviet space, that the unfortunate legacies of the Cold War era Sovietological study of Islam in Central Asia, Siberia, the Volga-Ural region, or the Caucasus, are receding to the point that they no longer have an impact, something comes along, often out of the blue, to remind me that the critique I've been belaboring for several years might still be relevant and might still be needed. Now, in this regard, before I come to that, I should acknowledge that the study of Islam in the Soviet Union has not been by any means the central focus of my scholarly work. That's one of the reasons it's odd for me to be here in this position. Though I've been railing for some time against the fact and the effects of the arbitrary segregation of historical study from interest in contemporary affairs, my work has mostly been focused on the pre-Russian, pre-Soviet, and now pre-post-Soviet eras. My forays into this field were restricted for some time to teaching. Beginning already in 1985, I taught with some regularity a course on Islam in the Soviet Union, later renamed to reflect the altered political landscape, by way of applying lessons learned from studying various more distant pasts to the analysis and critique of scholarship focused on Islam in the Soviet world, and then in the post-Soviet world as well. When I taught the course in 1985 and 1986, there were still few signs that my syllabus would not serve me well for the then foreseeable future. A fact that reminds me still of just how little of the future was foreseeable on the basis of the then dominant paradigms in the study of the USSR as a whole in the West. In many regards, alas, that situation has not changed, as I'll suggest below. Now, in those days, I necessarily used Benningsen's work and that of other scholars who framed what I would later call the Sovietological approach. But I had been to Soviet Central Asia, and I had studied the religious history of the region, and so I at least knew to point out to students some of the blinders, the problematical assumptions, the flawed analytical frameworks, and the limited and often misconstrued source base that characterized the Sovietological study of Islam in the USSR. Only quite a bit later, and still only occasionally, did I publish anything directly related to the study of Islam in the Soviet era. Just a decade after the dissolution of the USSR, I lamented the persistence of Sovietological questions and approaches in scholarship on Islam in the Soviet era in a review essay on Yaakov Roy's book, Islam in the Soviet Union, common title, in which prodigious archival material was put to use in a rickety analytical framework that should have been abandoned even in Soviet times, or perhaps never even constructed at all, but in any case should have at least been refined, if not wholly jettisoned, 10 years after the collapse of the USSR. Since then, I've occasionally written on the subject in reviews of various works. More to the point, 5 years after my review of Roy's book, I was proposing a more systematic critique of Sovietological scholarship. No sooner had I received some support and encouragement for this effort than I began to notice some signs that things might at last be changing, and that the scholarly scene with regard to Islam in the former Soviet space could be beginning to get its act together. It was in 2005 and 2006, after all, that Robert Cruz published For Prophet and Tsar, Douglas Northrop published Veiled Empire, Marianne Camp published The New Woman in Uzbekistan. Within a few more years, Adrienne Edgar published Tribal Nation, Adib Khalid published Islam After Communism, Maria Loeb published Everyday Islam in Post-Soviet Central Asia, and so forth. Though each of these contributions retained, in my view, some notable survivals of the Sovietological past, each nevertheless marked an important step forward, both in terms of the collection of data and in terms of analysis and interpretation. It seemed fair to take them as signs, that is, that a younger generation of scholars had arrived on the scene and would soon usher many, at least, of those old Sovietological canards into the dustbin of academic history. And yet, in some circles, the old ways die hard. And just when you think it is safe to get back into the water, so to speak, the Sovietological sharks begin to circle once again. Just a couple of years ago, as I was wondering how to begin a critique of scholarship on the Jadidists, Frederick Starr came to my aid to remind me of the persistence of hackneyed cliches on several fronts. And just a few weeks ago, as I was thinking about the remarks I would make here today, my friend and colleague, Alan Frank, sent me a PDF of a new publication, fresh off the press, about Turkmenistan, called Turkmenistan, Power, Politics, and Petro-Authoritarianism. It's cast as a policy paper, though at 100 pages, it's a small monograph. It was issued in March of 2016, hot off the press, by the Russia and Eurasia program of Chatham House, representing the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It was thus bought and paid for by British taxpayers. And I say that not pejoratively, admiringly, in terms of academics having trouble finding support for their work. As a country study, a common genre in policy analysis, this work typically cites press accounts, digests, radio liberty reports, and the policy papers of other governmental offices, chiefly American, that look very much like this research paper. As a country study, it profiles Turkmenistan's leadership, governmental structure, economy, education, and health system, human rights record, and so forth. Special attention is devoted, naturally, to the natural gas pipeline system linking Turkmenistan to the world economy and supporting its political elites in the style to which they have become accustomed. There is also, inevitably, a section on Islam in Turkmenistan. It runs to 5 pages, 5% of the whole, and appears right at the middle of the paper, privileged place. And it's here that the red flags, to which I and we are particularly sensitive, abound. By red flags, I mean not in the Soviet context, I mean red flags in terms of telling us to stop this kind of stuff, okay? The discussion of religion begins by referring to, quote, the broad process of re-Islamization in Central Asia during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and immediately narrows the focus to the issue deemed likely to interest the policy community. That process, we are told, I quote, was accompanied by the emergence of political movements that espoused a greater adherence to Islamic tenets. The author's aim in mentioning this adjunct emergence is in fact to contrast the situation in Turkmenistan, where, quote, there has been no widely visible movement to introduce elements of Sharia or to establish political parties based on Islamic principles. She's contrasting that with what prevails elsewhere in Central Asia, as if avowedly Islamist parties or any other political parties have flourished in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. The strange juxtaposition aside, the more telling content so far is once again the proposed measuring stick for Islamic influence on politics. It would be introducing elements of Sharia. Suffice it to say that even though we in this room no doubt share a more nuanced and simply correct understanding of what the Sharia involves, one can readily imagine what elements this author had in mind. And the other mark is forming political parties, a process, it may be noted, that has faced historical discouragement, to put it mildly, and contemporary restrictions or outright bans across nearly all of the post-Soviet world. Nevertheless, we can presumably breathe a sigh of relief on the Turkmen front. By the author's clear measure, we don't have to worry about Islam having political influence there, at least to judge by what is widely visible. To make this even clearer, we are given what looks like analysis based on polling data. The vast majority, and I'm quoting again, the vast majority of the population appears to prefer to dissociate religion from politics altogether. With categories like these, after all, don't we all know that religion is separate from politics? Who needs actual analysis? By the way, I would also call attention to the telltale signs of the author's understanding of what religion involves. Okay? It involves espousing tenets. It involves principles. Okay. The author next helps us understand the distinctive character of Islam in the country under consideration. Islam in Turkmenistan, she writes, is an unusual blend of Sufi mysticism, Orthodox Sunni Islam, and shamanistic and Zoroastrian practices. The cult of ancestors is still observed, and reverence for members of the 4 holy tribes, the Awlat, remains strong. I thought there were 6, but never mind. There's already a lot to unpack here. First, we are reminded that Islam in Turkmenistan is unusual, and then that it is unusual because it is a blend. Presumably, there are places in the world where Islam is not unusual and is not a blend. Second, we are treated to a distinction held dear by Salafists and Wahhabis, but largely absent from serious scholarship for at least a half-century, between Sufi mysticism and Orthodox Islam, with the additional reminder that Orthodox is more or less the equivalent of Sunni. So much for the Shia. Presumably, it would be unusual enough just to mix Sufi mysticism and Orthodox Islam, but no doubt the mixture's unusualness is heightened by the 2 additional substances added to the blend. which seem to reflect both ethnic and territorial understandings of what lies beneath Turkmen religion. The shamanistic elements are no doubt to be understood as coming from Turkic ethnicity, the Zoroastrian practices from the essentially Iranian territory, perhaps, of what we might call Turkmen Khorasan. How these four elements were mixed and in what proportions is not indicated. But we've seen this kind of stuff before. Fourth, we are told that the cult of ancestors is not only observed, but is still observed. The latter intensifier reminding us that the so-called cult of ancestors is not to be understood as an expression of respect for one's parents and ancestors and family rooted in an Islamic framework, but is to be recognized as a holdover, a survival from pre-Islamic times, though whether it survived from shamanism or Zoroastrianism is not clarified. Maybe it came from something else altogether. And finally, we can at last concur, if not with the number of the holy tribes or their link with a cult of ancestors, then at least with the ongoing respect in which they held. The characterization continues with the explanation that popular or folk Islam, another typical terminological intervention of which we'll find some further discussion below, is built around practices and beliefs related to Sufism. Sufism is then explained as, I quote, the mystical dimension of Islam that originated in Central Asia. Now, I'm always eager to give credit to Central Asia for many important phenomena, but this statement will, of course, be a surprise to, well, at least the spirit of Junaid Baghdadi and other early Sufis who reached Central Asia only by reputation. The brief characterization ends as follows, and I quote, the veneration of holy places, which are generally tombs connected with Sufi saints, mythical personages, or tribal ancestors, continues to play an active role in the preservation of religious feeling among the population. Unquote. With this, I must note, I can't find too much to quibble with, aside from the implication that the natural trajectory of religious feeling is self-evidently to disappear without the intervention of some discrete force. In this case, the veneration of holy places implicitly ascribed agency in and of itself. That preserves it. Well, we're only 2 paragraphs into the author's discussion of religion. I've used up nearly 5 pages in pointing out these problems. I can't proceed at the same pace, but let me say a few more things. The discussion turns next to the question of whether folk Islam is a national or religious phenomenon. The question itself, of course, assumes that national and religious are discrete, essential, and universally accepted categories of analysis, and the discussion goes on to make clear the author's understanding that national means much the same as secular. The author doubles down on reifying folk Islam, even coming up with an oddly discordant set of terms to distinguish folk Islam from Orthodox Islam. Despite the author's fidelity to Turkmen forms of names and terms reflecting the latest Latin Turkmen alphabet, she introduces 2 Persian phrases to suggest, presumably, the indigenous acceptance of the distinction she wishes us to adopt. Her folk Islam is the equivalent of Islami Khalq, and her Orthodox Islam is the equivalent of Islami Kitab. Aside from reminding us of the author's own conviction that Orthodox Islam is bookish Islam, these Persian or Tajik phrases raise a number of questions. Where did the author get them? Why did she mention them here in the Turkmen context? And yes, we're allowed to ask this as well. Do they actually correspond to a division that makes sense? If we're unsure about the character of folk Islam, the discussion offers a further characterization. In addition to having shrine pilgrimage at its heart, folk Islam is primarily concerned with the celebration of life cycle rituals, the observation of the principle of sacrifice, and the preservation of mystical beliefs. I'm not certain of what the principle of sacrifice is or how it is observed. As for mystical beliefs, I would be intrigued to know what this author thinks that these evolved, aside again from being in imminent danger of disappearing without a special effort at preservation. The discussion goes on to contrast folk Islam with that of the purists and Islamists and other aspects of government religious policy, in noting that the Turkmens were prohibited for health concerns, an old issue in Hajj policy. They were prohibited from making the pilgrimage to Mecca in 2009 and were advised instead to make pilgrimages to holy sites in Turkmenistan. The author reminds us that, quote, most of these had historical or cultural rather than religious significance. She goes on to discuss Turkmenbaşi's Ruhname, and then enters into an unfortunate historical discussion about Soviet policy toward religion and about Turkmen Islam before the revolution. In the latter part especially, we meet yet again the same inane statements about Islam among the Turkmens that can be found in much of the secondary literature straight back to the Soviet era. After distinguishing Central Asian Islam in general from the Islam practiced in mainstream Muslim countries, the author explains that Islamic doctrine had never taken root as firmly in Turkmenistan as it had in other Muslim areas, including the older sedentary territories of Central Asia. Now, it's not clear how the sedentary territories are understood to be older than the ground on which nomads trod, or why the modern territory of Turkmenistan, at present and mostly since its establishment as Turkmenistan, inhabited by quite sedentary Turkmens, and much of it in the past forming part of the old sedentary region of Khorasan, why that should be set apart from sedentary Central Asia, unless it is to highlight the hackneyed tropes of nomadic religion, and that's indeed what follows. The Turkmen, we read, like other nomadic peoples, preferred to pray in private rather than visit a mosque. And a mobile lifestyle necessarily favored a non-scriptural popular version of Islam, while naturally curtailing the presence of professional clergy. One might object that such a pronounced preference about where to pray signals a rather firm commitment to praying, but never mind again. It is the necessary and natural effects of nomadic mobility that are the most ludicrous elements here, though some things are left unclear. Mobility evidently precludes learning to read, or perhaps it just precludes carrying books around. One wonders about the impact in Central Asia's religious history, among the nomads at least, if they had had iPads or other mobile devices to keep them in line with scriptural Islam and steer them away from the popular version of Islam. Likewise, one wonders if it was the book learning of the professional clergy that prevented them from learning to ride and thereby accompanying the nomads in their mobile quests. Maybe it was something else. Perhaps the book learning of the clergy just slowed them down and left them unable to keep up with the swiftly mobile nomads. In the end, of course, these ridiculous characterizations are based on misunderstandings of nomads, of the clergy, and of religion, whether scriptural or popular, as well as on specific ignorance of the extensive evidence we have on religion among nomadic peoples. But this is what passes for analysis of Turkmen and Central Asian religion still in 2016, or at least this is what passes for analysis intended for the very highest levels of government in the UK. The discussion continues with the old juxtaposition of Sufis versus ulema, Sharia versus adat. The latter, we're told, had been passed down for many centuries, evidently unlike the ever-fresh Sharia. And it concludes in full Sovietological mode by reverting to mosque counts, madrasa counts, clergy counts, and haji counts. Reading through this account of Islam in Turkmenistan, one is led to two central questions. The first, well, even both, in fact, I won't attempt to answer. It sort of depends on the second. The first question is whether this ludicrous account of religious life in Turkmenistan should be taken as a reason to doubt the reliability of the paper as a whole. Seeing the dismal and crude level of description and analysis in this short section, should we extrapolate and doubt the author's credibility or sophistication in describing and analyzing the Turkmen economy, or even, say, the pipeline maps presented in the paper? I'll leave this for others to assess, even as I hold fast to a conviction that this sort of rot is symptomatic of the persistent problems facing scholarship on Islam in the post-Soviet space. What I mean in this connection is this. One might readily object that in criticizing such a presentation, I'm only grasping at the low-hanging fruit of policy analysis, taking on the easy target instead of grappling with more serious scholarship. Guilty, okay? But my answer in this regard is to note that this sort of analysis is supported financially and prepared and submitted as the basis for policymakers to make real-life decisions about, well, in this case, the UK and Turkmenistan. If this is the level of analysis, of thinking upon which policymakers base their policy, what can we expect from government policy? Cynics might say that the two are in fact unrelated, that policy papers are prepared by a subset of academics who are looped into government circles but are not actually read by anyone with actual power or decision-making authority. and that the errors noted here are thus of no consequence. And that may well be true. But at the same time, even if we're sure that no adverse consequences will ensue from policymakers being supplied on a regular basis, I would stress, with characterizations of religion and Islam that are, simply put, ludicrous, what does such a paper suggest with regard to the scholarship upon which the author relied in producing it? Does it suggest that better scholarship is simply hard to get at, or so severely underpopulated in the field, however we define that field, that academics writing for government consumption cannot be expected to find it? Does it suggest that the government consumers of such reports find the better scholarship irrelevant to their questions and prefer the crude simplicities of the bad scholarship? The answer is probably important, but it's not what I want to focus on today. Rather, on the assumption noted earlier that a systematic critique of Sovietological and, by extension, Soviet approaches to Islam in the Soviet Union is still needed, I would like to review a series of recurrent features of scholarship reflecting those approaches, all of which, in my view, reflect problematical and usually misleading assumptions, faulty conceptual and analytical frameworks, and unilluminating or baseless conclusions. The first point to stress in this regard is that these recurrent problems are not a thing of the past. Outside this room, I would even say that they still dominate the field. Despite the problems reviewed below, which took shape in the Soviet era, most discussions of religious life in the Muslim regions of the post-Soviet world, even today, draw heavily upon the characterizations of Islam in the Soviet Union forged in Soviet and Sovietological literature. They ask the same questions and largely get the same answers, though in some cases their methods have changed through the use of surveys filled with questions based on the same essentialized understandings of Islam that pervaded Sovietological literature. The concerns are much the same as well, where Sovietologists hope for Muslim-inspired militancy, perhaps to be led by Soviet Sufis, that might topple the Soviet state. Contemporary observers obsess about Muslim-inspired militancy, minus the Sufis, that might spill across the borders of the newly independent stance. Reasoned attempts to assess what Muslim religious life actually looks like in Central Asia, Siberia, the Volga-Ural region, or the Caucasus in Soviet times or today are still few and far between. As a result, the mistakes of Sovietological literature on Islam in the Soviet Union are mostly being repeated and perpetuated in what we might call post-Sovietological literature on Islam in post-Soviet spaces, such as this report on Turkmenistan. So, I would ask you to bear with me while I outline several of these problematical features. I've identified 15. I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint to make them, I'll try to signal when I'm starting a new one. Some of these might be broken up into multiple issues. No doubt others could be added to this still preliminary list. In fact, I would like to invite you all to help me add to this list. Well, the first, I put first because it's of personal concern, special interest to me. It's the notion of light and inconsequential or defective Islamization among the formerly nomadic peoples of Central Asia, above all the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, but including even the Turkmens, as we just heard, and at least some Uzbeks. In some cases, all of Central Asian Islam is declared to be defective and not even really Islamic, with two analytical subsets. Either it was always thus, with Islam never really taking root in the region, a ludicrous historical proposition, to be sure, but one that passes for serious historical background in much of the literature. The other alternative is that the Soviet experience corrupted Islam in the region and made it light, inconsequential, or defective. Now, I've sought to undercut this notion with regard to Islam among some nomadic peoples in Central and Inner Asia, beginning with my old study of Islamization, which was focused less on countering such claims by saying, oh yes, Islam was strong among the nomads, than on asking for a more meaningful and a sensible approach to what Islamization might mean and how we might detect it historically. Nevertheless, neither my arguments nor those of others have made much of a difference in the post-Sovietological literature. As for the version of this fallacy that blames the Soviet experience for weakening Islam, this has been tamed not only by Western post-Sovietologists, but by some in the post-Soviet space, who use it to criticize, and as they intend to reform, Islam among their fellows, and of course by external Salafists and Islamists. Now, I'd like to say much more on that front, but I have 15 things to go through, so I'm going to move on. A second issue is the mantra of Islam versus nationalism as an analytical strategy. This was in all likelihood, though I won't claim to have done any statistical analysis, the most frequently repeated problematical claim or assumption about Islam in the Soviet era. It usually involved first separating from religion from national feeling, and second, arguing or claiming that religion was on the wane, while nationalism was the wave of the present and presumably the future. Oddly enough, on this front, Bennigsen was somewhat of an outlier. Though he stressed and studied the emergence of nationalism and the impact of national consciousness on communism, he sought to argue a stronger role for religion, as he framed it, in supporting, actually or potentially, hostility toward the Soviet state on the part of the Soviet Muslim citizens. His arguments were based on an understanding of religion as an ideological system with an underlying institutional framework, and on an understanding of Islam as a universal focus of religious attachment. His writings suggest that he did not envision Islam as something deeply embedded in the historical and cultural consciousness of Soviet Muslims. It was, rather, a belief system with some accompanying rituals, and one could measure fidelity to religion as opposed to fidelity to the Soviet system by the extent of belief and the performance of the basic rituals. Broadly speaking, the entire Sovietological and post-Sovietological enterprise in addressing the issue of religion versus nationalism as it was framed ignored religiously framed notions of communal identity that dominated in earlier times, but also persisted with remarkable adaptivity into the Soviet era. It posed false, or at least unilluminating alternatives, rather than textured and intermingling layers in analyzing communal identities, and it assumed an evolutionary developmental sequence with religious identities prior to the more modern national ones. One might suggest that this sequence has clearly been laid to rest by the recent spread of Islamist agendas, but the preeminence of national and ethnic sentiment over religious feeling is still a cherished assumption of most specialists on the Soviet and post-Soviet eras. In that regard, it's noteworthy that the most recent twist in this cherished assumption is to privilege national identities over Islamic identity. Again, the possibility of multiple layers and kinds of Muslim identity is typically not countenanced. But this privileging is done by insisting that Islam became, in Soviet times, merely a component of national identity and culture, just a part or a subset of an identity that is fundamentally national in essence. This, of course, was the claim of Adib Khalid in Islam After Communism, but it is shared by many, if not most, observers of post-Soviet Islam. It is as if these observers took the famous hadith, affirming that love of country is part of faith, and implicitly declaring that the Prophet Muhammad got it wrong on this point, turned it backwards to read that faith must be part of love of country. Such assumptions naturally rest on the developed theories of nationalism that inevitably privilege the constructed world of modernity as providing the conditions in which nationalism emerges. Without entering into debate here with those theorists or with their admirers among students of Soviet and post-Soviet Muslim nationalities, we may suggest that what both camps miss, the theorists and the applied students of Soviet Muslim nationalism, is the still largely unstudied role of earlier, but again ongoing, patterns of placing Islam at the center of communal identity, whether through stories of Islamization that serve as communal legends of origin, through the sacralization of communal space through shrines, or through various articulations of communal kinship rooted in ancestral saints. That these patterns might be labeled traditional and hence pre-modern should not deter us from considering their impact in the Soviet era and in the here and now. But they most assuredly do not enter into the theories of national sentiment developed by scholars with, let's acknowledge it, a shallower historical perspective. Without belaboring the issue further here, I would note that the trajectories of such traditional modes of articulating communal identity, which place Islam at the center of communal integrity and do so with variants of religious language, mythic, cosmological, sacred historical, and so forth, leaving both the content and the mode of expression fundamentally religious, must themselves be framed as objects of historical study. Historicizing the process, that is, allows us to note that by the 19th century, we find those so-called traditional modes of articulating communal identity employed with respect to communities that were envisioned in terms of our familiar modern ethnonyms. My point, to be sure, is that distinguishing the modes of articulation as traditional and the ethnonyms as modern obscures the historicity of the process. But at the same time, should not that historical process be recognized and incorporated into theoretical constructs about the emergence of nationalism? This may be too much to hope for. If nationality studies is forced to acknowledge the preparation for modern nationalisms in patterns and processes with pre-modern roots, could the field survive as nationality studies? A third characteristically problematical feature of Sovietological and post-Sovietological scholarship on Islam is a pattern of remarkable misinterpretations of the roles of Sufi communities in Tsarist, Soviet, and post-Soviet times, but especially in the Soviet era. Beginning with Bennigsen, a small but surprisingly vocal group of Western scholars claimed that Sufism was the key to keeping Muslim religiosity alive in the USSR, and that Sufism manifested itself chiefly in the form of clandestine but potentially militant opposition to Soviet authority. Bennigsen's student, Chantal Lemercier-Kelkacay, wrote, for instance, I'm quoting, that the fundamental role of Sufism in the Soviet Union is the preservation of the purity of Islam by providing the population with a minimal religious organization without which the mass of believers would probably forget the faith of their ancestors. Now, I'm not going to take time to deconstruct this claim in all its wrong-headed particulars, but it's quite sobering to recall just how passive and negligent the mass of believers is portrayed in this view. More broadly, Bennigsen and his followers equated Sufism in the Soviet context with shrine-centered religious practice of any and all kinds. They imputed to Sufis an organizational and militant presence. They came close to claiming that Sufism arose as a response to Soviet policies, and they overlooked the substantial historical legacies of Sufi groups in communal life and religious practice. Perhaps needless to say, none of this scholarship ever engaged directly with the actual sources on the history of Sufi communities in the regions of the Soviet Union, or grappled with organizational and transmissional changes among Sufi groups that left the language of the brotherhood largely anachronistic in many regions. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Bennigsen School's errors regarding Soviet Sufis, however, is the unwarranted academic backlash that followed the realization that in most of the Soviet world, the notion of militant Sufis was a pure fantasy. This was taken as a reason to ignore Sufism altogether, and thereby to miss the opportunity to rethink what Sufism was and wasn't in the Soviet period, and to recognize the multiple ways in which phenomena rooted in Sufism shaped Muslim religiosity throughout the post-Soviet space. I've discussed elsewhere some of the rethinking I believe is needed, and very reluctantly I'll move on from discussing a subject also dear to my heart. But I would notice that we all talk about Sufism and we assume and say that it's an ism, but we all probably mean different things by it because, well, historically it manifests itself in different ways, and yet we use this single term as if we can talk seriously about it by using that term. Okay. A fourth feature is the inordinate attention to and uncritical assessment of the reformist elements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the so-called Jadidists, who were interpreted in isolation from the study of earlier reformist impulses and of broader trends in religious history in the world of Russian Islam, and who, through seriously skewed misjudgments of their orientation and historical appeal, were typically portrayed as popular and modernizing forces opposed by obscurantist clerics. Well, okay. I've recently discussed what I see as some of the many problems with Jadido-centric scholarship, and some in this room have done far more in this direction, so I will not repeat my comments here. But what has not yet been thoroughly problematized or explored, however, is the way in which the Jadidist narrative shaped Sovietological understandings of the character of Islam in the Soviet Union, and thereby shaped even the current normative views of Islam in the post-Soviet space. Number 5, moving quickly. But here I'll have to dwell a bit longer. To some extent, this reflects the impact of Jadido-centric scholarship. What I have in mind for the 5th is the adoption in Sovietological and post-Sovietological scholarship of narrow and unfruitful definitions and measures of religiosity that privilege standards of an essentialized Islam over long-standing patterns of actual religious thought and practice. Such measures of religiosity include essentially meaningless standards of literacy or religious knowledge and specialization. They were rehearsed quite often in the Soviet era, but they've taken on new life in the post-Soviet age as previously impossible research methods became accessible. I'm referring, of course, to survey research. Even partisans of surveys will acknowledge that the results are only as good as the questions employed. So let me consider the following account from a survey published already back in 1994. It's old, but some more recent things could be cited in the same vein. And I quote, "Respondents were asked, 'Do you consider yourself a believer?' Those who answered yes were then asked, 'What faith do you profess?' The proportion expressing faith in Islam was higher among the Kyrgyz, 81%, than among the Uzbeks, 52%, and Kazakhs, 49%. The high incidence of believers among the Kyrgyz is somewhat surprising, since they, and the Kazakhs, often describe themselves as the least Islamic and most European of the Central Asian peoples. Almost a third of the Uzbek believers and two-thirds of the Kazakh believers could not correctly translate the sentence, 'There is no God other than Allah and Muhammad is his prophet,' from the Arabic. Furthermore, about 2/5 of the Uzbek believers and 3/4 of the Kazakh believers said that they do not pray. As we see, not only ignorance or neglect of specific ritual obligations, but ignorance of Arabic as well is taken as a sign of defective Islam. Religiosity was defined in terms of faith, intellectual proposition, and the performance of religious rites in a way that Salafists would find comforting. The demand to translate the Shahada is a particular irony, overlooking what the Shahada is and does from a Muslim standpoint, but such measures extended in Soviet times to both official and unofficial clergy. Many of both classes were decried for their ignorance of the Quran or of Arabic or of illiteracy in general. As for ritual observance, another survey explored the question of whether subjects performed their required religious rites always or only sometimes. One wonders if it never occurred to those who formulated such questions that the answers might be skewed considerably precisely among the sort of people they might otherwise, with a moment's reflection, regard as particularly pious or devoted. That is, the sort of people who sincerely or insincerely gave voice to the virtue and propriety of humility and self-abasement, expressing one's imperfect, inadequate, undeserving character, or were indeed genuinely conscious of a certain incompatibility between religiosity and outright boasting. Perhaps the majority of respondents who claim to be observant sometimes, let us leave aside the problems entailed by referring by the required practices and so forth, maybe they were simply being humble, or merely acknowledging that their religious performance was lower than their religious aspiration. Maybe they were just modestly giving voice to some quite human self-doubt. Perhaps some of these were not just reminded of their imperfection by the posing of the question during the survey, but were given to greater introspection and self-accounting by deep religious feeling. Of course, awareness of religiously motivated or religiously framed humility or self-doubt may be especially difficult to come by among those trained to detect signs of ethnic, national, or sectarian pride. Perhaps those 18% of the total, we're told, who were sure that they always observed what was required of them, should be dismissed either as liars or as obscenely prideful, and in either case counted as the least religious group within the sample. Perhaps more instructive than the problematical wording of such questions, however, is simply what was counted, the kinds of religious behavior that the surveys sought to quantify. Belief, observance of the 5 pillars of Islam, and occasionally observance of various prohibitions, with alcohol consumption invariably stressed and an arguably more pervasive historical marker of Muslim identity, the avoidance of pork, rarely mentioned. Let us consider briefly the kinds of things that are omitted from such surveys, ostensibly focused on religiosity. As noted, the surveys often ask about prayer, but a key issue linked with prayer that is typically ignored is the notion of ritual purity and the structuring of space and time so as to facilitate the maintenance and restoration of purity through specific ablutions and broader cleanliness standards. Purity, indeed, has been a key component of Muslim identity, with non-Muslims recognized as to some extent impure. These issues are all left unaddressed in such religion surveys. Similarly, issues of dress and comportment and the adab of speech and conduct are nowhere recognized as religious matters to be measured or asked about. Patterns of dress, of course, changed significantly in the world of Soviet Islam, though various adaptations of older patterns, generally cast as reflective of national customs of dress, in fact express mores rooted in religious principles and adab. It's worth noting further, with regard to comportment, that ways of behavior and principles of conduct and the very forms of ordinary human actions remain part of the Muslim inheritance, even when not recognized by those who observe them simply as the way things are to be done, or as the way Uzbeks or Kazakhs, for instance, do things. For a time in the early post-Soviet period, my town, Bloomington, was often the place to witness young Central Asians, even the most secularized after long isolation from the rest of the Muslim world, encountering non-Central Asians who inexplicably behaved like Uzbeks or Kazakhs, and realizing that what they had assumed was Uzbek behavior was part of a Muslim way that was also manifested in the behavior of Pakistanis and Moroccans. The point is not that the unconscious Muslimness of their conduct is more important than their conscious description of their conduct as the Kazakh way or Uzbek etiquette and so forth. The point is that at a fundamental level of everyday life and ordinary activity, beyond matters of belief or unbelief, practice and piety or laxness and secularism, the very physicality of ordinary mannerisms is imbued with a recognizable Muslim component that links the individual with a broader world, the Islamic world, sets him apart not just from non-Kazakhs, but from non-Muslims, and offers a potential entry point for the choice of deepening and interiorizing a rationale for such Muslim behavior, whether in traditional terms or in reformist terms. Let's go even further into manifestations of religiosity that one never finds measured or even much discussed. Economic issues were, naturally, central to the Soviet Marxist project, but we rarely find any discussion of the impact of Soviet policies on the religious aspects of economic life, aside from accounts of the seizure of Waqf property and religious buildings and their transformation into other uses. Unaware of the multiple ways in which labor and economic life were sacralized in pre-Soviet Muslim society, Sovietologists rarely discuss the social and religious impact of the decoupling of religion and work that occurred through the Sovietization of economic life. But by the same token, they also miss the continuation and adaptability of the religious aspects of traditional craft production in spheres that had been reshaped by the Soviet transformations of economic life, as revealed, for example, in Sneserev's account of auto mechanics guilds, essentially, in Khwarezm. In this regard, it's noteworthy how many post-Sovietological writers continue to ignore the role of shrine-centered religious practice, chiefly, no doubt, because of the assumption that it belongs to folk Islam or pre-Islamic Islam rather than to real Islam. To his credit, Bennigsen did discuss shrines, though misinterpreting them as bases of Sufi orders. And attention to shrines has increased substantially since 2000, though it still eludes most policy analysis frameworks. Through the 1990s, however, shrines remained largely invisible in discussions of post-Soviet Islam. Likewise, finally, the connection of Islam and kinship structures has also remained off the radar for much of the literature on Islam in the post-Soviet world, despite the clear social, economic, and even political importance of these religiously defined groups, and despite the key links between the sacralization of kinship and the sacralization of the nation. All of these phenomena, in short, are intimately connected with patterns that can be detached from religion only through the narrowest and most historically uninformed definition of religion. Yet discussion of Islam in the post-Soviet world still proceeds on the basis of surveys that are framed without addressing these phenomena, and in fact without any awareness of them. What kind of picture of religiosity in Soviet or post-Soviet times can such measures yield? The sixth problematical feature is the broad acquiescence in Sovietological literature in the analytical fragmentation of the religious lives of Central Asian Muslims, adopted by Soviet, nationalist, and fundamentalist circles, into narrowly construed Islamic elements on the one hand and folk or popular or everyday elements, usually classed again as survivals of pre-Islamic religions, on the other. This fragmentation continues in post-Soviet times with appeals to presumed national pre-Islamic traditions. The net result of such analytical fragmentation is to ignore, miss the coherence of religious life and its meaningfulness as religious life to those who engage in activities relegated by the analyst to different origins. It also obscures or ignores the historical process, whereby phenomena with possible origins in pre- or non-Islamic contexts were Islamized and made part of Muslim practice. It typically entails a historical leap across centuries of Muslim tradition to locate a certain rite's origins in a more distant past. Now, I've discussed the notion of religious survivals elsewhere, and I won't dwell on it here. But I would note that this is not the only analytical strategy that makes mischief in our understanding of Muslim religious life in the Soviet or post-Soviet worlds. The distinction made between folk and real Islam, or everyday versus formal Islam, can be equally harmful. The notion of Butawi Islam, after all, sets up a distinction that inevitably casts the everyday version as inferior to the real or formal version, and also makes a distinction in terms of context and functionality. Just as we might use our everyday china for ordinary meals while reserving our best settings for formal occasions, or just as we wear our everyday clothes more regularly than we put on our best, the ordinary version of Islam is taken to be less valuable, even if it's more comfortable, than the formal version that is kept in reserve. Now, my metaphor ends with the latter point, of course, because those who deploy everyday Islam are typically assumed not to be holding the real, formal, more valuable version in reserve. Another additional noteworthy feature of this analytical mischief is the recurrent theme of religion becoming just life cycle rituals. We're often told, that is, of the distinction between high Islam and folk Islam, with life cycle rites relegated to the latter. And we're likewise told, in some cases, that a given community, perhaps nomadic or implicitly ignorant, or in some cases all Soviet Muslim, has forgotten or abandoned learned Islam and adheres only to the life cycle rites of folk Islam. Consider the implication here. When religion has to do with ideas about God and the afterlife and with the performance of prayers and so forth, it is both important and authentic. But when religion affects only such minor events in a person's life as birth, marriage, and death, it is readily dismissed as insignificant and somehow aberrant. The larger problem here, of course, is that such an attitude forestalls coming to terms with the ways in which the most intimately experienced aspects of religiosity might interact with and shape or be shaped by other aspects of religiosity that post-Sovietological researchers find more significant. Once again, it's the central, if often misguided, concerns of such researchers that suffer the most in terms of understanding from their short-sighted and profoundly unimaginative approaches. The seventh issue I'll gloss over very quickly. It's receded somewhat, although in the 90s it was current, and it has historical and contemporary dimensions, and that is the craze, especially in the early 1990s, to be sure to fit the development of Soviet Islam, especially Islam in Central Asia, into either the Turkish or the Iranian model. Okay, now there's a huge literature that does just that. I'm going to ignore it. The eighth point, is the misinterpretation of extremist agendas and of the broader framework of exclusivist and fundamentalist approaches to Islam as traditional or relics of the medieval past, ignoring the essentially modern, and I use that term guardedly, character of fundamentalisms, and ignoring also the joint assault on traditional patterns of religious life in the Soviet and post-Soviet worlds, shared by the Soviet state, the official Soviet religious directorates after a certain point, Soviet-trained nationalists, and foreign Islamists, eager to shape religious discourse in the post-Soviet world, and willing to exploit the insecurity of many Muslims in that world regarding the quality of their knowledge and practice of Islam. Now, to some extent, this is a problem of Islamic studies more broadly, but it's also of particular importance for the post-Soviet world and is connected with my ninth point, making progress. The ninth issue is the neglect of religious developments in the Soviet era that were directly connected with the emergence of extremist groups in Central Asia and elsewhere that were completely missed by outside observers. Here I have in mind chiefly some of the things that we've heard of today, but earlier, work by Bakhtiar Babajanov and Minov about the emergence of the appeal of Salafist-style versions of Islam. And again, I'm going to skip over this to save time. My 10th time is in fact, and it's a big one, okay? But I'll try to keep it short. It's a series of inadequate and misleading ways of parsing Islam, involving the creation of largely arbitrary categories into which aspects of Muslim religiosity are divided. Most involve the creation of simple binary oppositions. Within the sphere of religion, Sovietological scholarship treated us to a host of these pairs: official versus unofficial religion or Islam, orthodoxy versus heterodoxy, bookish versus unlearned religion, elite versus popular, legalist versus Sufi, learned versus folk, high versus low, and so forth. Perhaps the quintessentially Sovietological binary opposition, of course, was the division of official versus unofficial or parallel Islam, a distinction that in principle makes some sense in legal and administrative terms, but inevitably entailed a misguided mapping of legal status onto modes of religiosity, styles of religious practice, and types of religious specialists. This conflation of legal and administrative categories with modes of religiosity was then often projected into the past, but it caused the most mischief in accounts of Islam in the Soviet era. We can readily think of other oversimplified contrasts: conservative versus liberal, traditional versus modernist, political versus quietist, militant versus non-threatening, and so forth. We can also acknowledge that some things can move back and forth in these binary opposition. The case again is Sufism, the transformation of Sufism from a militant threat to a mainstay of peaceful and national Islam, and back now, it seems, to at least some sort of threat in post-Soviet times, is a case in point. I would also consider the broader reach of such binary oppositions to govern and segregate religion itself. The literature on Islam in the Soviet Union contributed to scholarship on religion not only a series of binary oppositions within the world counted as religious, but between religion and other phenomena regarded as standing outside religion. Religion versus nationalism, religion versus secularism, religion versus modernity, all writ broadly, to Islamic versus Soviet, or Muslim versus Marxist, in a somewhat narrower framework. These simplistic binary oppositions were rarely argued, but were simply assumed as the starting points for discussion, with religion understood and defined in the most constricted terms. Often the definition of religion, if ever made explicitly, guaranteed that many things would stand outside it, and the ensuing analysis of the various binary oppositions was offered as proof of the basic correctness of the definition. I would note, though, that even the basic juxtaposition of Islamic versus Soviet is at last beginning to break down through the work of various scholars who are beginning to acknowledge or recognize and teach us that Soviet Muslims could aspire to be good Soviet citizens and good Muslims at the same time. I'm thinking of Aaron's work on this front. But others have contributed in this direction as well. My 11th factor, I'm running out of time. My 11th problematical assumption has to do with difficulty in coming to terms with that legitimate framing of official Islam, namely the institutional framework established for Muslim communities during the Soviet era. Sovietologists usually insisted that this was entirely a co-opted, sold-out operation that had no popular support. We're learning that that isn't the case. But Sovietology also overlooked internal differences between center and periphery, and so forth. This also is beginning to be illuminated by the work of various scholars who are giving us insight into Soviet-era fatwas and the archival materials of the religious boards. The 12th item is a set of wrong-headed assumptions about the impact of Soviet ideology and Soviet-style modernization. This, I think, is a feature of post-Sovietology more than of the earlier phase in the development of the field. And we often read that the attraction that Islamist ideology or Salafist modes of religiosity hold for some post-Soviet Muslims stems from the failure of Soviet or Marxist ideology, or from the failure of the Soviet system to fully modernize the lives and thought of Soviet Muslims. Soviet ideology in this view was undermined by the collapse of the Soviet Union and left a hole in the minds and lives of Muslims who were thus vulnerable to a competing ideology to fill them. From my perspective, however, these narratives once again overlook the similarities between the intellectual formations to which reformist and puritanical religion tends to appeal and those for which Soviet ideology and Soviet modernity, in fact, offered superb preparation. Though this pattern may change and is to some extent impressionistic, I believe that much of the sociological and ethnographic scholarship on post-Soviet Islam suggests that the appeal of Islamist or Salafist or Wahhabi rhetoric about purifying Islam and oneself is strongest precisely among the most Sovietized of Soviet Muslims. Those who remain closer, that is, to the traditional modes of religiosity, now attacked by Salafist groups, have been as a rule less attracted by such rhetoric and less inclined to see, for example, shrine-centered practices or healing traditions or amulet collecting and so forth as contrary to Islamic rectitude. On the intellectual level, the analysis of religion offered by Soviet ideology, which distinguished real from folk Islam, and saw on the latter a pre-Islamic or national aberration, likewise prepared those Soviet Muslims who drank most deeply from the Marxist-Leninist well to find the Salafist distinctions quite sound and acceptable. Yeah, let's skip over this to get to these other points. The point I'm trying to make is that it is not so much the failure of Soviet ideology, but precisely its success that, in some cases, has heightened the receptivity to such agendas, to such intellectual formations. Number 13 is the predominance, ongoing, and I made mention of this before, of the threat assessment approach to the and the hunt for militancy. And I'm going to skip over that quite well. There, I'm on to number 14. The 14th is the overall directionality of religious developments assumed to characterize the Soviet era. Namely, the insistence that what the Soviet era oversaw and promoted was a gradually accelerating diminution in religiosity among Soviet Muslims. Now, this naturally fit into the broader narratives of secularization as an accompaniment of modernization beyond the Soviet world. Already in the classic Islam in the Soviet Union, published in 1967, Bennigsen and Le Messier wrote, "What remains of the Muslim religion after some 50 years of administrative, police, and scientific measures designed to encompass its disappearance? On the surface, very little. The 5 pillars of the faith, incumbent on all believers, are no longer observed regularly." Again, a measure that we find. It's immediately noteworthy that so much scholarship on Islam in the Soviet Union concluded that religiosity had waned so thoroughly during the Soviet period that it had no public dimension because of Soviet restrictions, and yet simultaneously argued that its most important role might nevertheless be to foster anti-Soviet sentiments among a population that was potentially hostile toward Soviet rule on multiple grounds. Well, the decline in religiosity in Soviet and then in post-Soviet times has been argued on the basis of the typical tools of religiosity. The irony is that Islam disappeared only from the sight of those who used the wrong tools to search for it and who defined it in such a way as to keep it out of sight. To some extent, this reflects a confusion of policy with the actual results of policy. Finally, number 15, I've come to. The discourse of morality is a relative newcomer to the language of scholarship on Soviet and post-Soviet Islam, but I believe it too holds some potential for mischief. There's a recent spate of mostly sociological and ethnographic studies that foreground issues of morality when discussing issues that would once have been framed within the general rubric of Islam in the Soviet Union. There was actually not much discussion of morality in the Soviet logical literature, aside from the occasional acknowledgement that members of the official religious establishment sometimes affirmed the confluence of sorts between socialist morality and Muslim moral principles. More recently, discussions of Islam in a particular post-Soviet space have often put issues of morality, moral aspirations, and the construction of moral selves at the forefront, to the point that other aspects of religiosity recede into the background or disappear altogether. To some extent, this trend should be taken as a positive development, insofar as acknowledging that religiously informed moral development should be part of what we mean by Islam in the post-Soviet world, or anywhere for that matter. And it marks a step forward from looking for Islam only in the threatening, the militant, or the overtly political. Yet there's also a danger in renaming religion as morality. Sometimes this may be done with various theoretical constructions in mind, or simply because some academics are uncomfortable with religion in the first place and find morality a more soothing concept. But this renaming may also tend to crowd out the many other facets of religiosity that cannot be reduced to morality, and it risks, once again, privileging the versions of Islam that downplay or reject those other facets and sell their brand of religion as a means of personal moral cultivation. In other words, this academic trend risks privileging the scripturalist, reformist, and puritanical versions of Islam by foregrounding individual moral development and individual moral responsibility, along with the various directions these concerns may lead in. This approach may thus contribute to another unhelpful bifurcation of Islam into its moral components deemed positive and its ritual, thaumaturgical, therapeutic, and social components, once again relegated to secondary importance. Scholarship highlighting morality as the key field in which religion operates subtly privileges rigorous and scripturalist versions of Islam and their call for moral purification. Right? Well, that concludes my 15 points. I have a bit more, but I see that I'm running out of time already. So let me just summarize briefly what I would have said. My next section, okay, was to give some earlier examples based on something that precedes the 2016 Turkmenistan report by some 12 or 13 years, an article on fundamentalism in Central Asia, and I even in fantasy world envisioned perhaps having people ring a bell every time one of these cliches was encountered as we read that. But that isn't going to happen, clearly. I also wanted to say a few things about what I see as one of the underlying problems that the field, writ largely, still is hesitant to deal with. And I have in mind here simply how many of those 15 points are subsumed within a failure to grapple with issues of religion, right? And definitions of religion, bringing an essentialized understanding of what religion is as if it's always and everywhere the same thing, and going astray on that basis. We have constant references in the literature to what is religious and what is not. And this is seldom second-guessed, this is seldom handled critically, and, well, isn't an hour enough? I would have gone on even further to talk about things in that light. I especially, since we're focused on language, wanted to highlight a couple of articles that lay out the cliches that we use in talking about religion on various fronts, and might give us some caution in deploying those cliches again. And my last section, all right, was to make some suggestions about what we could do and how we could think about the Soviet world as a religious space. That's what my title was about, and I relegated this to the last section, thinking I might get to it a bit sooner. I'll just throw these out by way of provocation. Okay, the first here there were only four, mercifully. Okay, only 4 points. The first is that in line with looking at what we're beginning to understand about the Soviet era, despite the narrative of Soviet atheism contrasted with religion and its opposition to religion, the governmental opposition, I think there are grounds for acknowledging, first, that the Soviet Union was a kind of harbor for religious vernaculars, for local manifestations of religious practice in the Muslim regions of the Soviet Union as well, that were in effect sheltered, officially governmentally opposed and so forth, but in effect, okay, to look at the results of policy rather than just the policy, they were sheltered from trends toward globalization and uniformization elsewhere in the world. Now those trends are coming into the sphere at this point, but they didn't during much of the Soviet period. A second point was that we tend to see the Soviet Union as something that was on the policy framework opposed to national development. Various scholars have shown us the importance of the Soviet era in fact, contrary to policy, fostering the growth, the cementing of national divisions. I think if we look at the post-Soviet space in the Muslim world, we see a similar process in which attention to religion has become an essential hallmark of post-Soviet governments. It's a sign of good governance to create an ecumenical space. So it simply occurs to me that in addition to being an affirmative action empire, as we've been told, that the Soviet Union was something also of an ecumenical empire that taught religions or that valued religions living in harmony. And that discourse isn't gone. Okay? That discourse has continued, largely speaking. So the affirmative action empire becomes the rhetoric of the friendship of the peoples has been paralleled by the rhetoric of the friendship of the faiths. And, well, in some quarters at least, the friendship of the peoples is not so keen, and it makes a difference in Russia, less so, I suppose, in Central Asia. But what we see is that rhetoric of the friendship of the faiths replacing that. A third point, okay, is just to acknowledge on a broad scale that, in fact, this diminution of religiosity may not have happened. We speak of a revival, but if we look at the kind of material that, well, for example, Aaron is bringing forth, that many others have brought forth in the post-Soviet space, the kind of material that Paolo was talking about, the kind of material that Alfred is uncovering, and many others have uncovered as well, we find that the Soviet Union was a profoundly religious country. And we have a knee-jerk reaction that, oh no, it's an atheist state. But religion, contrary to policy, and contrary to some narratives of oppression and so forth, religion, if we understand religion in a different way, was doing quite well. Otherwise, it couldn't have survived and into the post-Soviet era with the vitality that it showed very quickly. And my fourth point was simply, in conclusion, to emphasize that, among other things, the Soviet era was a large-scale generator of religious material, of religious texts, of religious sources. And these are the kinds of sources that we have not made use of adequately. Back in 1985 and 86, and in teaching Islam in the Soviet Union, I would tell students that, well, how is this approached now? People try to read between the lines of Soviet publications and glean something out of the official press, and this is what we're limited to. But I would also say that, look, we have additional sources to understand this world. We have folkloric material, we have ethnographic material that was ignored in large measure by the kind of Sovietological school. On top of that, we're now realizing the extent of Islamic manuscript production right through the Soviet era, and beginning to pay attention to that. To some extent, I can blame my own kind, historians, for not fully acknowledging that. Historians are apt to want a 15th century copy of a 14th century text. But think about what it tells us about religiosity in the Soviet Union, that Soviet citizens were copying a 14th century religious text in 1939, in 1965, in 1981. Okay? So there was something going on there in the generation of religious material that I had a few more coherent comments to make, but I'll stop there and thank you for your indulgence.